Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about how answers to the question of who we are, and that's the field called philosophical or theological anthropology, how that shapes our approaches to counseling and social programs. So let me just talk about what are some of the key questions of theological anthropology. So one key question, and many of you have probably heard of the Imago Dei. So, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? So, there's a lot of theological depth, a lot of information in the Bible on what that means. And then there's other things. So, sin. How does the concept of sin impact our understanding of who we are? Redemption. How does the concept of redemption and grace impact our understanding of who we are? There's different models and emphases on the relationship between the body, soul, and spirit. What model do we use? Which aspects do we emphasize? What's our relationship to nature based on who we are? And how do we relate to nature, animals, and the physical world? Are we way above it? Are we just one, animal? Are we just, atoms? How do we relate to that? So then there's questions like life direction, and ultimately this is where all this is going. So what are the implications of our answers to these questions on the meaning of life, how we should live, and definitions of health? Now, in other lectures, I've talked more extensively about the difference between Christian and secular worldview. So I'm not going to go into as much depth on that, but worldview answers key questions. Dominant meta narrative, your way we discern truth, who we are, fundamental problem, solution, how we should live, and then the values. Now, the key thing that I want to emphasize is whenever you're talking about philosophical and theological anthropology, these questions that I have, highlighted here, these are the key questions. So, who are we in God's image, but fallen, holistic, social people is the answer we're presenting in this course. Whereas, secular science might answer thinking animals, collection of atoms, or it's provided by the field. So, the answer to that is, answered by psychological anthropology. And then, what's the fundamental problem in the field at psychopathology? What's a solution that is provided by the field, psychology, or maybe counseling, versus sin or salvation or holistic spiritual growth? And then how should we live, love God, love others, versus individual pleasure maximizing or self-actualizing? So these have really big implications on things. Now, one of the books that we use has, adds a little bit more detail that I think is helpful to talk about the differences in worldview. In particular, they talk about, some different assumptions between psychology and theology, the different methodologies. So the assumptions, the world's knowable and predictable, following what's called methodological naturalism, and then this biopsychosocial, versus the assumption with theology is that God's revealed word, the Bible, is discernible and is a guide to faith and practice. The assumption is that there's both natural and supernatural explanations, and humans are created in the image of God, finite and fallen. And then there's different methodology. There's naturalistic empiricism and rational inquiry versus biblical hermeneutics, natural theology and rational inquiry. And then, how do you organize things? So the whole field of psychology, there's tons of theories, right? Within theology, often you use systematic theology, or the theological pyramid's another way of framing it, also. And then you have, what are the ideas and goals? So understanding and improving life by reducing suffering and optimizing ideal conditions. And then here you have, ideas and goals of just understanding salvation, sanctification, meaning, stewardship, worship. Now, coming back to some of the key questions, one of the key questions is, what model are we using? So the foundational core of who we are has profound implications on what are the causes of problems. So in the field that's called etiology, and attribution style, and in the field of counseling. So, and then what are the most effective interventions to bring transformative change? So if you have this secular materialist model of who we are, of the body is usually the most emphasized thing, and then you have the mind built on that, and then you have these other concepts of self, then often what happens is you're going to emphasize interventions focused on the body. This is Dallas Willard's model of who we are, and there you have, what he puts as the spirit and the heart and the will, and there, what you're really doing is you're saying, let's focus on what you can change, and then, so God comes in and he redeems you, but then you're working out from your will to influence other things. So, your mind, your body, your social, your soul. And there, the difference here, these two models have profound implications of their differences. But one of the main differences is this model provides a much stronger emphasis on personal responsibility. Whereas this model can tend itself to say, well, I was born this way and therefore I'm stuck. And what model we use has big implications, right? So then there's another question around just the philosophy of who we are in a deeper way, affects our understanding of how life transformation happens. So you have this philosophical framework, and there's a lot of terms, you can look these up if you want, but modernist, you separate out disciplines, rational, secular, and individualistic. And what's happened is over time, Christian counselors have, realized some of the limitations. So, but what has been great about the field of counseling is applying science to the mind and behavior and counseling. And here the answer of who we are is, comes from the discipline of psychology, and how life transformation happens is through psychological theory and skills in clinical counseling. So then if you're a Christian counselor, you're adding in theological perspectives. So the philosophical framework, you're largely still working within that framework that's kind of required in the profession. But then you're also adding in answers from the field of theology. But I emphasize the head. This is more of emphasis on kind of rational answers. And ultimately what you're adding is you're saying, we're going to build on this, and may have some disagreements in some areas, but we're trying to adopt correct theology and Christian worldview, and you're trying to apply Christian worldview to counseling and psychology is basically what this dimension's adding. Then here, and this is the second book that we use, really is adding in the fact that, well, just getting a checkbox of having the right theology isn't enough. We need to actually focus on changing people's spiritual character, and doing that through a spiritual formation process, and often an emphasis with spiritual disciplines. And, ultimately, the improved understanding there is emphasizing the importance of spiritual disciplines. Now, more recently, there's been a strong push recognizing that, all of these frameworks are largely individualistic. They're focused on what, an individual needs to do. But Christianity, recognizing that Christianity is a team sport, and that we are social creatures, so are social, beings. And so there, your model is holistic Christian community. And if previously this is individualistic and will centered, this is going to be much more community and relationship centered. So you're saying to have life change, you need deep relationships and healthy Christian community, and just recognizing that life transformation is more caught than taught or willed. So these are the perspectives that we're using in this course, and that's really why we've designed the course the way that we've designed it, is to help kind of you expand your toolkit that you can use. So another important aspect of theological anthropology is just, how do we think about sin? What is the problem? What do we emphasize? So in psychology, the problem is psychopathology, and that's a useful framework. The fact that there's so many different categories in the DSM is very useful, but it can also be useful to have a complementary and, in some cases, contrasting view. And so with a model of who we are, you have these different components: spiritual, ethical, psychosocial, and biological. Now, and so this model comes from Eric Johnson. It's a really good video. You can get the link from the slide or from within the course. But the idea is that sin happens whenever these different things get out of order. And recognizing that there's different types of sin that can be out of order from just original sin as a consequence of Adam and Eve, can be a consequence of personal sin, or it can be a consequence of suffering, that's something that you didn't necessarily cause. Cause you're experiencing the sin of others. So then in the Bible, and it talks about sin, but it also talks about weakness or poverty in asthenia. I don't know if I'm going to be saying that. It's damage to God's creation, not due to personal sin. So that's biological damage, psychological damage, social damage that can happen, to us. So I'm probably not giving this proper summary. Eric Johnson's summary of this is much better, but it can be helpful to have this framework as a contrasting framework with psychopathology, because again, as people of faith, this can help be a good framework for life change, rather than just saying, I have this diagnosis in the DSM. So then another question of theological anthropology is, what is health? What model are we using? What do we emphasize? And one of the books that we use in this course, Psychology, Theology, and Spirituality, provides this model. And the idea is that you have a definition that combines spiritual and psychological health. Do you have an accurate awareness of yourself? Do you have healthy relationships? And do you have an accurate awareness of need? And these can get off. So you could have self-absorption, so narcissism, or self-hate, or lack of self-constraint. So these are ways that your awareness of self can get off. And then faulty relationships, so you can have dependence, you can exploit others, you can have a splitting, where you're completely different people in different contexts. And then awareness of need, so you can adopt the victim role. You can have bitterness towards people. You can have cynicism. You can have helplessness. So what we're trying to do is work towards healthy spiritual and psychological health. Now, part of, I'll just use an example of, this is an example of trying to integrate theological models with psychological models for health, but you can also take some theological concepts. So you take the concept, in one key aspect of theological anthropology is the concept of the imago Dei. So the imago Dei is the theological concept that we're made in God's image. There's a really good YouTube video in free course on this called "What is Man" by Third Mill. But the lesson 2 on the image of God relates to this concept. So if you go through that, it talks about, throughout Christian history, there's been basically 3 views of the how we relate to the image of God. So one is that God assigned an office to us whenever we were created. We're designed to be co-creators. And we're designed to be stewards. So there's an office. So that's the functional model. Then you have the structural model. So there's ways that we have similar attributes to ourselves, similar to God. And then the third area of how we're similar, have similarities to God is in our relationship with God. Now you can take these 3 concepts of imago Dei, and they have different emphases. And they also relate to different counseling focuses. So you have, in counseling, you can focus on symptoms. So, if relating that to the office, someone can abuse their office by saying, they kind of take the role of God, or they cannot step up to the office that they're called to. So this largely has a big implications for the sense of self, can have big implications for the sense of need, big implications for healing relationships. Same thing with structural. So you can think about, in what ways are we similar to God, in what ways are we not, and then in relationships. So as you go deeper into these concepts, and the chapter that touches on this in the book kind of spells this out more. it can be helpful to have a bridge between these theological concepts and the counseling concepts. So again, in this book, Psychology, Theology, and Spirituality, part of what he does in this book, so his goal is to not only bridge theological and psychological perspectives, but to add in spiritual formation perspectives. And then he has that model that we just talked about, called the accurate, the model of spiritual and psychological health. But throughout the course, what he's essentially doing is he's saying that, okay, well, if you're going to be a Christian counselor, you're going to have to deal and you're going to try to integrate in theological perspectives and spiritual formation perspectives. You're going to have to deal with some of these challenges in the field. So you have dominant views of health. You're going to have to expand the definition of training. That's part of the point of what we're trying to get across with City Vision. Just because you're a Christian and you had secular counseling doesn't mean that you understand how to integrate Christianity with counseling. And there's these other challenges that for most of the chapters in the book, he's going through and explaining, how each of those chapters relate to these challenges. Now, part of what we're doing differently in this course is much as we love that book still is focused on a clinical counseling perspective, and most of our partners, clinical counseling is only one part of how they're bringing life transformation, and a lot of it happens through community and programs. So we're adding in one more component to that. So let me just kind of synthesize this into how worldview emphases on who we are can influence programs and outcomes, as an example. So you take, and this could be a rescue mission, or it could be, any sort of, Christian ministry, and you contrast that with secular homeless shelter. So you start with a theology or worldview, and then you take the practical theology, and you have Christian holistic approach versus quantitative best practices in harm reduction, is the way I would argue they're following. In the fundamental problem, a holistic approach, and I explain kind of a 4-quadrant understanding of that, versus an emphasis on the physical. So if you're following science focuses a lot on the physical. So then the fundamental problem often becomes a lack of housing and overdose deaths. And then your solution, for Christians, it's salvation plus meeting holistic needs. Here, based on the fundamental problem, you need physical intervention. So you need housing, usually housing first, plus medicine. So who you serve, anyone, for a lot of our partners, they're dry shelters, and people ready for change is the next tier, usually for residential recovery. And then secular homeless shelter is anyone, often a low barrier shelter, so people can come in drunk, and often they're doing medication assisted treatment with things like methadone that many Christian ministries would argue is more of a substitute addiction. You're keeping people alive, but they're still largely addicted. And so then the question is, what programs are you going to offer? So rescue missions offer, an overnight shelter plus Christian recovery. And here the programs are housing first plus methadone plus safe injection sites. And then you have different funding sources, private funding versus government funding, and then you have different outcomes. So here you have spiritual outcomes, housing, job, sobriety, healthy relationships. And here you have a focus on decreased deaths and number of homeless. Now, you can see that worldview emphases have huge implications on, program and outcomes. And I use this kind of as an example because in a lot of cities, this is kind of the dominant, framework. Now, I want to talk about another thing that relates to, this book that we're using in the course. So he talks about some of the different studies that have been out there, and he has a diagram in this book, and he says that there's been a lot of studies on specific forms of psychotherapy, so cognitive therapy, psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, and the point that he makes, and empiricism is what you use in science. So it's the focus of hundreds of psychotherapy and outcome studies. So there's been lots of studies on things approaching this. Now, here's the problem with empiricism. I don't know if you've heard of the streetlight effect, but the idea is a guy goes to someone and he says, you lost your keys, and he sees him looking under the streetlight, and he said, where did you lose your keys? And he said, well, I lost them over there, but the light's better here. Often that is the tension between empiricism and life transformation. So empiricism is a street light. It's a very useful tool. We should use lights. Street lights are helpful. But having said that, there's often spaces in understanding life transformation that it's hard to get at a grip with on through empiricism. So, and part of what he talks about is you have specific forms of psychotherapy, and a lot of people are like, we got to do cognitive behavioral therapy. And it has a lot of good evidence, but then there's also in the field there's something that's called common factors. So that's basically relates to the character and just the kind of intuitive skill of the counselor and the relational skill. So how strong are they at developing a therapeutic alliance, at positive expectations, confronting problems. And a lot of ministries, they hire people who are just really, really good relationally. So that is their strength. They may not know, 1,000 theories, but they're really good at this. And most of the studies that have been out there is actually that the common factors of psychotherapy are more important than the specific forms of psychotherapy. So, but there aren't as many studies on these common factors, and they're harder to get to. But there's other things that are just really hard to get to for empiricism. So things like, how does the character of the counselor affect things? I mentioned my own personal counseling experience. It was the maturity and character of the counselor that had the biggest effect on me, more than anything else. The alignment of their worldview with my worldview had a big impact. And so you have weaknesses of empiricism in the same domains that the strengths of ministries are. Now, there's also, so if you take this holistic model that we're promoting in this course of, this ministry competency cube, so you have a lot of different competency dimensions, and you have a lot of different intervention dimensions, and you have a lot of different client development dimensions. So empirical studies are good at measuring whenever you change one thing at a time. But typically, a lot of ministries take a holistic approach, and instead of just changing one variable, you're changing many variables at once. So that's one challenge of getting good empirical data. The other is many religious interventions and techniques are heterogeneous. So what empiricism needs things that are fairly homogeneous. So for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, often it's easy to administer in similar ways with different psychotherapists, whereas something like prayer, both the skill and implementation of the prayer could be very different. How Eastern Orthodox do prayer, how Catholics do prayer, how charismatics do prayer, doing prayer where you're laying on hands and you're doing inner healing prayer is very different from I'm praying for a client before and after the session silently, or I'm praying for them, in 30 seconds at the end of the session. All those things are hugely different, and it's just difficult. A lot of the studies, they don't get into those differences. And then the last thing is the alignment of religious intervention techniques with both client and counselor belief system is critical. Let me just use an example. So if you are an Eastern Orthodox and you have a certain approach to prayer, if someone comes in with charismatic Christian, laying on of hands, intense Holy Spirit approach to you, that's going to be horribly offensive. Where if there's an alignment of the client and counselor belief system, then it may be much more beneficial. So what are the implications for that? So we've talked about in other lectures, you have this epistemological model in clinical counseling, what's I call secular evidence-based practice. So you're combining clinical experience with client values with best research evidence. So that's empiricism. Now, what often happens is you have this empiricism being dominant, because you want to sound more scientific. And for ministries, I'm not a big fan of that. And the reason why I'm not a big fan of that is it's the streetlight effect. Often, you're recognizing that empiricism is good at answering certain questions, but it may not be able to get to all the factors that you realize will transform your clients. And so a lot of ministries will follow something more like this, where you emphasize the client values, you emphasize your clinical experience, you emphasize scripture, but you recognize that there are limitations of best evidence, the published empirical studies. So that may not be your dominant factor in all these things. It's important to look at those, but it's also important to recognize in our approaches. Now, you can decide with your own ministry, do you want to be more like this, where you're going to, really emphasize the empiricism, or do you want to be like this, or do you want to be something, more balanced? But it's helpful to think about, what are your values, what are your worldview, and how does that shape your model towards all of these things? So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, please ask your faculty.